Right. So those who join online, can you see the screen?
Yes, sir.
Right. So we will start the second topic, accounting for income tax. Right. So this accounting for income tax, as I told you, right, I'm taking relatively difficult advanced topic at first, right? So we had the financial instrument last two sessions. Today we will take income tax. So basically, when it's come to income tax, the accounting for simple income tax payment is very easy thing, right? You already aware of that even for advanced level, right? Companies need to pay income tax on quarterly basis, right? Until the year end, until we calculate the total income tax liability, the first quarter, first 3 months income tax paid in the second quarter, so that you credit cash, debit tax expense. Likewise, by end of the year, 3/4 income tax should have been paid. Quarters තුනක tax ගෙවලා තියෙනවා. Say for example, a business, a company paid income tax 1 million each for the first 3 quarters. So as at the year end, we have 3 million income tax expense what is paid. Then end of the year, when we calculate the total income tax liability for the year and agree with the inland revenue, say it is 4.5 million. So 3 million already paid. The total liability 4.5 million, 1.5 million tax payable, right? If it is not agreed with the inland revenue, then you will record it as provision for income tax, because that can be changed. But if it is agreed, you can call it income tax liability 1.5 million. Next year, you have to first pay that 1.5 million. Tax expense would be paid tax 3 million plus payable 1.5 million, the total 4.5 million income tax, right? It's just accrued expense. So if that's all about income tax, we need not a separate accounting standard for accounting for income tax. The reason is this accounting for income tax standard mainly focus the deferred tax adjustment for income tax. So even though standard name is accounting the income tax, LKS 12 income tax is the standard. However, it mainly focus on accounting for the deferred tax part, deferred tax adjustment in relation to income tax, right? So we look at what is this deferred tax. So when you take accounting profit, that means when you here we take the accounting profit means profit before tax. Before tax profit is calculated based on Sri Lanka accounting standard guidelines. We prepare financial statement, we recognize income and expenses based on standard guidelines. So when you take the statement of profit or loss, we have sales, revenue, cost of sales, gross profit, other income, admin, distribution, finance, other expenses, all that we have measured as per the accounting standard guideline. So accounting profit, that means profit before tax of a business, say 100 million, that is calculated based on accounting standard. Assume the tax rate is a flat rate, 30% income tax. Then income tax expense is not 100 million into 30%. Right? This 100 million profit before tax is accounting figure calculated based on the accounting law, the accounting rule standards. But tax calculation, we have separate tax law. That's why you are learning separate subjects called taxation. Right? So, even though accounting profit calculated based on accounting standard is 100 million, the tax is payable based on taxable profit, which is calculated based on inland revenue guideline in Sri Lankan country. Right? Tax authorities guideline. These two may not be the same. If it is the same, right, we can very easily complete the standard, right? There's no difference between accounting profit and taxable profit. But we calculate tax profit before tax for accounting purpose based on standard. If same is allowed to pay the tax, it's very simple. But all over the world, globally, as well as Sri Lanka, tax is paid based on tax rule given by the tax authority of the country. So taxable profit and accounting profit may not be the same. For example, when the accounting profit 100 million, taxable profit may be 120 million or 80 million. Right? So there's a difference between accounting profit and taxable profit. This difference arises due to two reasons. One is permanent differences, which we cannot do anything, that is the law, tax law. Now, for example, certain expenses are disallowed for tax purpose. Right? සමහර වියදම් තියෙනවා tax වලට අඩු කරන්න දෙන්නේ නැහැ. Business එකේ වියදම හැබැයි tax purpose අඩු කරන්න දෙන්නේ. Right? So can't help. That's the law. So you have to pay higher profit, higher tax than the accounting profit. Right? අපි හිතමු දැන් accounting profit එක 100 million එද්දි taxable profit එක 120 million. Accounting profit 100 million, taxable profit 120 million. That include 5 million expenses that we deduct for tax purpose, accounting purpose, disallowed by tax authority. Right? සමහර expenses තියෙනවා උදාහරණයට කාලෙන් කාලට advertising expenses. Only a percentage is allowed. Right? 25% is allowed, 50% is allowed, likewise. So if the advertising expenses 5 million disallowed for tax purpose, total advertising expense say 10 million, only 5 million can be deducted for tax purpose, balance 5 million disallowed. So you have to pay higher tax. Can't help. So we can't do anything for the permanent difference. But some of these differences named as temporary difference. Temporary difference. That means accounting purpose you treat in 1 year as income or expense. It will be treated as income and expenses in a different way for tax purpose. But when you consider a time of period, right? So say about 4 or 5 period, it is anyway deducted or deducted as expense or considered as income for tax purpose as well as accounting. Only temporary difference. Simple example, if a particular income is accounted tax based on cash basis. Right? Income එක tax වෙන්නේ cash basis. So end of the year we have 5 million income receivable. In accounting, you credit that into income and debit income receivable. So your profit includes that 5 million for accounting purpose this year. But tax purpose, it has not received it. It will be taxed in the next year when you get it by cash. So then what will happen? Accounting profit 5 million more by this year and tax profit is less. But when it's come to next year, accounting profit will be less by 5 million and tax profit will be higher by 5. What the point? So treating this income for tax purpose in the next year, accounting purpose this year. So that difference is temporary. වෙනසක් තියෙනවා, වෙනස temporary. තාවකාලික. If you take another simple example, depreciation. A particular asset depreciated over 10 years for accounting purpose, 10% depreciation. Right? You depreciate 10%. So you have purchased 100 million asset. Accounting purpose, annual depreciation 10 million. So accounting depreciation determined by the entity. No? So you can decide the useful life, the management of the entity. But tax purpose should be determined by the tax law. So tax law says that this type of asset should be depreciated over 5 years. Then what will happen? For tax profit calculation, we deduct 20 million over 5 years. Tax purpose, 10 million over 10 years. Then when you take the first 5 years, accounting profit calculation, we deduct only 10 million. Tax purpose, we deduct 20 million. So that means accounting profit is higher. Tax profit will be lower. So as a result, we pay tax based on taxable profit. We are paying lower tax compared with the accounting profit. Clear? Accounting වලට 10 million depreciate කරන, tax වලට 20 million depreciate කරන. Right? 100 million asset එක. Accounting වලට 10 million ගානේ අවුරුදු 10ක් depreciate කරනවා. Tax law එකේ කියනවා මේ asset එක අවුරුදු 5න් depreciate කරනවා කියලා tax එක. Tax purpose we depreciate 2 million, 20 million over 5 years. So first year, accounting profit should be then 10 million above the tax profit. So we pay tax based on taxable profit. So we are paying lower tax compared with accounting. You will do it over the first 5 years. Then when it comes to 6th year, tax purpose 0 depreciation because fully depreciated. 20% into 5 years, fully depreciated. But accounting purpose, still you are depreciating. 10. So 6th year onward, you have to pay more tax compared with the accounting purpose. So these temporary differences can be result taxable temporary difference. That means this difference is a temporary that will create future tax liability compared with the accounting profit. Right? Accounting profit එකට වඩා වැඩිපුර ගෙවන්න වෙනවා. අන්න ඒවට අපි කියනවා taxable temporary differences resulting deferred tax liability. ඔක අනිත් පැත්ත ගත්තොත් accounting purpose depreciate over 5 years, tax purpose 10 years. Then that will create future deduction in the tax payment, deductible temporary difference. For that we recognize deferred tax asset. What is the rationale behind this adjustment? The rationale is if you take income statement up to profit before tax, all figures are calculated based on accounting standard. But tax expense is calculated based on tax law. Right? So you have accounting profit 100 million. Tax rate 30%. So if you pay tax based on the accounting profit, it should be 30 million. 30 million. However, taxable profit 100 and taxable profit is only 80 million. 80 million. Right? There's a 20 million difference. Assume that entire 20 million is a temporary difference. Right? To make it easy. So then what the taxable profit 80 million. 80 million into 30%, you pay to inland revenue 24 million. So if you charge that 24 million as your tax expense, you see there's a mismatch in the income statement, all the figures as per the accounting standard, but tax expense purely based on tax law. Right? So under deferred tax adjustment, what we do, okay, we identify there's a 20 million difference in accounting profit and taxable profit. Now we are paying lower tax, but you have to pay higher tax in the future, temporary difference. So this 20 million we call taxable temporary difference. අද අඩුවෙන් tax ගෙවුවට අනාගතේ ඔකට වැඩියෙන් ගෙවන්න වෙනවා. Then taxable temporary difference 20 million. Tax rate 30%. 20 million into 30%, 6 million we identify deferred tax liability. So that deferred tax liability we debit tax expense, credit to deferred tax liability. So then the actual tax payment 24 million plus the deferred tax liability, your tax expense adjusted to 30 million, which is in line with the accounting. Right? So this is a book entry. This deferred tax liability you need not to settle by cash outflow. You're not going to pay this to inland revenue. You're paying inland revenue the tax based on taxable profit. Right? But we make adjustment for the tax expense in order to show more fair profit for the period, more accurate, reasonable profit for the period. That is the adjustment. Right? So when we work out some activities, you'll understand this clearly. The objective of this standard is to prescribe the accounting treatment for income tax. The principal issue in accounting for income tax is how to account for current and future tax consequences. The future recovery of carrying amount of asset liability recognized in the financial statement and translation other events to current period that are recognized in the financial statement. So basically, even though principally the deferred temporary difference arise from accounting profit and taxable profit, this accounting profit, taxable profit is a single figure by considering all adjustments. So that might include some taxable temporary difference, some deductible temporary difference, right? ඔය දෙකම net off වෙලානේ මේ වෙනස එන්නේ. So we have to identify these deferred tax asset and deferred tax liability line by line. The asset and liability based. Right? ඒ නිසා අපි මේක accumulate කරලා හොයන්න බෑ. Accumulate කරාම net effect එකක් එන්නේ. So අපි transaction by transaction අපි බලනවා whether there is a deferred tax asset or deferred tax liability. The net වෙලා තමයි අන්තිමට taxable profit එක accounting profit එක අතර වෙනස ඇවිල්ලා තියෙන්නේ. Right? So accounting profit is the profit or loss for the period before deducting tax. Taxable profit is profit for the period determined in accordance with rules established by taxation authority, tax authority. Upon which income tax is payable. මම ගත්ත example එකේ accounting profit 100 million, taxable profit 80 million. Right? The accounting profit means profit before tax as per the standard guideline. Taxable profit is profit for the period determined in accordance with rules established by the taxation authority, upon which tax is payable. Current tax is the amount of income tax payable in respect of taxable profit. Current tax කියන්නේ සරලවම ගත්තොත් the tax calculated as per the taxable profit. This is what you should pay for the year as per the Inland Revenue Act. Right? Current tax එක කියන්නේ ඇත්තටම ගෙවන්න වෙන tax එක. Current tax. Tax expense is the aggregate amount included in the deduction of profit or loss for the period in respect of current tax and deferred tax. අපි tax expense කියලා අඩු කරන්නේ current tax එක විතරක් නෙමෙයි. දැන් current tax එක කිව්වොත් මම අර කිව්වේ 80 million into 30% tax rate 24 million. හැබැයි ඔකට adjust කරන්න ඕන deferred tax එක 6 million. So tax expense equal current tax plus or minus deferred tax adjustment. මේක එකතු වෙන්නත් පුළුවන් අඩු වෙන්නත් පුළුවන්. So we are going to discuss how to account for the deferred tax, basically along with the normal tax expense pay. Right. The remaining definition we will come after these activities, exercises. Right. When basic understanding activities වලට යනවා, then you can understand this once we complete these exercises. Exercise 1. So we take newly incorporated business, right? ABC incorporated on 1st April 2023. So we don't have prior tax, deferred tax liability or asset, newly incorporated. And income tax paid under self-assessment for year ending 31st March 2024, 800,000. පළවෙනි අවුරුද්දේ self-assessment වලට ගෙවලා තියෙනවා 800,000. And income tax liability for the year estimated as 1.2 million. Total income tax liability. The total income tax liability is the total amount payable to inland revenue for the year. Out of that, 800,000 already paid. So that end of the year, we have 400,000 payable. That is what you know about income tax, right? All that money. Tax expense account එකේ දැන් 800,000 ගෙවලා තියෙනවා. ගෙවනවා cash credit, tax expense debit. End of the year, total income tax liability estimated as 1.2 million. So then 400,000 debit tax expense, credit tax liability. Then deferred tax liability and deferred tax asset as at 31st March 2024, 350,000 and 150,000 respectively. You were given the calculated deferred tax liability and asset. For the moment, don't worry about how we get that. Right? We will discuss that today. First, we focus on accounting part. Right? So we can prepare the account for income tax expense, income tax payable, deferred tax liability, and deferred tax asset. 4 accounts for 2023-24. Can you prepare the account? The account හතර දාගන්න. අවුරුදු දෙකකට continue වෙනවා. 23-24 and 24-25. Now, first year, this is the first year of after incorporation. Income tax paid can debit cash, credit cash, debit tax expense 800. End of the year, total tax liability 1.2 million, 1,200. So 800 paid, 400 payable. Second entry, income tax expense debit, tax payable credit. 400. ඔගොල්ලෝ දැන්ට ගන්න විදිහට tax expense එක වෙන්න ඕනේ 1,200. නේ? අපි සාමාන්‍ය income tax advance level මට්ටමින් ගත්තොත්, right? So the tax paid 800 during the year, and end of the year total income tax liability is calculated as 1,200. So out of that 800 paid means 400 payable. So that you debit tax expense, credit tax payable. So then end of the period you can charge to P&L 1,200. But now we have a deferred tax liability. Deferred tax liability. End of the year, the deferred tax liability and deferred tax asset as at 31st March 2024, 350,000 and 150,000 respective. We have a deferred tax liability 350,000. So double entry for the creation of deferred tax liability. Here you see creation of deferred tax liability. Income tax expense account debit. It's a liability. No, we have to credit the deferred tax liability. So third entry, I'll take it in a different color. Deferred tax liability 350. Income tax expense debit, deferred tax liability account credit. මොකද අවුරුද්ද අන්තිමේ liability එක 350 කියන. Right? ඒ කියන්නේ carry forward liability එක වෙන්න ඕනේ 350. Since it's a newly started business, we don't have opening balance. So you can take this balance, current year creation also 350. Right? Then the deferred tax asset as at 31st March 2024, 150. And a deferred tax asset account එකේ carry forward balance එක 150. ඒ කියන්නේ අලුතෙන් tax asset එකක් create වෙන්න ඕනේ. Zero තියෙන opening balance එක නෑ. අලුතෙන් පටන් ගත්ත business එක. This is the first year. So the creation of deferred tax asset is 150. Deferred tax asset debit income tax expense credit. And deferred tax asset එකට debit කරනවා. Income tax expense එකට credit කරනවා. 150. So the double entry for the deferred tax liability, when a new deferred tax liability create, income tax expense debit, deferred tax liability credit. ඉතින් හරි ලේසි liability ගන්න නම් ඇති වෙන්නේ liability credit කරන්න ඕනේ. අනිත් entry වෙන්නේ tax expense. ඒක debit වෙනවා. Deferred tax asset එකක් create වෙනවා නම් you have debit the deferred tax asset. So credit entry go to the tax expense. Then for the first year, you can see the debit side total 1,550. So what we charge to P&L as expense 1,400. So you see, it is not the amount paid, or it's not equal to total income tax liability as per the inland revenue. Inland revenue එකට ගෙවන්නේ 1,200යි. හැබැයි expense එක විදිහට අපි ගන්නේ 1,400යි. This is by making the appropriate adjustment for the deferred tax. Now this tax payable balance can be carried forward to next year. The tax payable account එකේ 400 balance එක එනවා ඊළඟ අවුරුද්දට. Deferred tax liability also we have a balance 350 for next year. Deferred tax asset, we have a brought forward balance of 150. Right. Now next year, we have the information for the next year. So 24-25, income tax paid under self-assessment 900. Total income tax liability 250. Last year income tax payable was fully settled. ඇත්තටම මුලින්ම ගෙවන්නේ ඒකනේ. ගිය අවුරුද්දේ ගෙවන්න තියෙන එක මේ 400 තමයි අපි මේ අවුරුද්දේ මුලින්ම ගෙවන්නේ. ගිය අවුරුද්දේ අන්තිම ක්වාටර් එකේ payable එක. Right? ඕක ගෙවලා දානවා. Right. Then current year මේ අවුරුද්දේ පළවෙනි ක්වාටර් එකේ ගෙවුණා second quarter එකේ. Right? Likewise during the first 3 quarters pay taxes paid in the current year. So that is given income tax paid for the 24-25 900. Total tax liability 1250. So 900 and total tax liability 1250. So out of 1250, 900 paid means 350 payable for the current year. That you can transfer to tax payable account of current. Right? මේ අවුරුද්දේට 900ක් ගෙව්වා. ඔක්කොම 1250යි. එහෙනම් තව 350ක් ගෙවන්න තියෙනවා. ඒක tax payable වලට ක්‍රෙඩිට් කරනවා. tax payable වල opening තිබ්බ 400 මුලින්ම ගෙවන්න වෙනවා. දැන් මෙන්න මෙතන තමයි පළවෙනි point එක deferred tax වල වරද්ද ගන්න තැන. Deferred tax asset and liability. Asset and liability is given as at a particular date. Asset balance එකක් තියෙන්නේ not for a period, right? Asset and liability be present on the statement of financial position balance as at 31st March. So the deferred tax asset and liability as at 31st March 2025, 750 and 350 respectively. ඒ කියන්නේ 31st March 2025 වල deferred tax asset balance is 750,000. That is the carried forward balance. That is not the deferred tax asset liability created for the current. Deferred tax liability as at 31st March, balance is given 750. එහෙනම් අපි දැනගන්න ඕනේ මේ තියෙන්නේ අවුරුද්ද අන්තිමේ deferred tax liability balance. And deferred tax asset as at 31st March 2025, 350. So deferred tax asset account carried forward balance is 350. Right? So දැන් මේ ගානේ අපිට දීලා තිබුණාට අපිට calculate කරන්න වෙනවා deferred tax asset and liability. When you calculate deferred tax asset and liability, that is the year end balance. right? Deferred tax liability as at 31st March 2025. So opening balance 350 becomes 750 to the closing balance. That means during this period, there is a new deferred tax liability creation. 400. 350 750ට වැඩි වුණා කියන්නේ. අලුතෙන් මේ අවුරුද්ද deferred tax liability credit වෙන්න ඕනේ 400. So that 400 credit deferred tax liability, debit tax expense. එහෙමයි ගන්න. එහෙනම් දැන් මෙතන 750 තිබුණ නිසා කෙලින්ම deferred tax liability එක 850 කලුතෙන් ක්‍රියේට් වෙනවා කියලා දැම්මොත් වරද. හරිද බයි? You will be given when you calculate or when you are given, it is the deferred tax asset or liability year-end balance. 31st March 2025 balance. That is 750. Opening balance 350. So 350 increased to 750. This year creation of deferred tax liability 400. Same way, deferred tax asset, right? Here carried forward balance 350. Deferred tax asset. And make a balance karahama. Creation of deferred tax asset for the current year is 200. Deferred tax asset debit, income tax expense credit. So for the 2025, we charge to P&L as tax expense. Debit side 1,650. So charge to P&L 1,450. Tax expense account, tax liability account, credit side 750. Of that 400 paid during the year, so we can carry it forward to next year. 350. That's it. Right. Now I think you don't have the problem. Use කරන්න වෙයි, especially when we have company account for the data, right? We use this calculation. Any question? Already pointed out that deferred tax. They have creation of deferred tax liability, debit tax expense, credit tax liability, deferred tax liability, and creation of deferred tax asset, debit deferred tax asset, credit income tax. Creation of deferred tax liability, debit income tax expense, deferred tax asset plan, deferred tax asset debit, income tax expense. And this deferred tax asset liability is calculated as at the year. Balance is given as at the year. So year to year, creation of deferred tax asset or liability is the difference between opening and closing balance. First year is a newly incorporated business, so it did not have opening deferred tax liability or deferred tax asset. The අලුතෙන් පටන් ගත්ත business එක. එතන පළවෙනි අවුරුද්දේ balance එකක් තිබ්බේ. So year deferred tax liability එක සමාන වුණා creation. ඔය දෙවෙනි අවුරුද්දේ යනකොට එපමණයි. දෙවෙනි අවුරුද්දේ opening 250 තිබිලා තමයි 850 වෙන්නේ. So the double entry should be passed for deferred tax liability creation. The difference 400. Okay. විභාගයට වගේ ඔයගොල්ලන්ගේ අහුවොත් financial statement extraction එකක් කළාට අහන්න account එක අහන්නත් පුළුවන් financial statement. The income tax expense, so we have already got that for 2024 1,400, 2025 1,450. Then the deferred tax asset we record as a non-current asset. The deferred tax asset for the 2 year. Right. Carry forward balance among what. So the deferred tax asset carried forward balance first year 150, second year 3, non-current asset. Deferred tax liability is a non-current liability. මොකද impact එක අවුරුදු ගාණක් පුරාවට business එකට එන්න පුළුවන් ඉස්සරහට. So that liability carried forward first year 350. Second year 7. And this income tax payable first year 400, second year 350. That's the basic liability. Current liability. ඒක ඔයාලා දන්නවා tax payable එක current liability. Positive extract ටික පෙන්නන්න. Once you prepare the accounts, these extracts simple, right? So you have to show them what is the expense, what are the balances end of the each year. Make accounting වැරදුනොත් එහෙම tax expense එක තමයි mainly වැරදි. Right? Deferred tax asset liability anyway that is given. Right? So you can just take the given balance. Okay. Right. Well, අපි ඊළඟාට යන ඊළඟානත් මේ mode එකමයි. Right? දැන් මේක ඔයගොල්ලන්ට මුල ටික තේරුම් නැත්නම් I can you just join little late, right? So okay, you can get the because this question deferred tax liability and asset balance was given. Right? You were given the deferred tax liability and deferred tax asset end of the period. Right? But practically you have to calculate it. So there is a formula for deferred tax liability calculation. When there is a taxable temporary difference, you multiply it by the tax rate then you can have the deferred tax liability. If there is deductible temporary difference multiplied by the tax rate, you get the deferred tax asset, right? So the exercise 2 එකෙන් 1 එකක් cover වෙනවා. ඒ knowledge එක deferred tax liability equal taxable temporary difference into tax rate. Deferred tax asset equal deductible temporary difference into tax rate. දැනට ඔයාලා taxable temporary difference deductible temporary difference මොකද කියලා දැනගත්තේ නැති වුණාට කමක් නැහැ, right? I am taking this step by step, right? අන්තිම ගානට එනකොට මේ ඔක්කොම clear වෙනවා. මුලින්ම අපි ගත්තේ double entry එක විතරයි පළවෙනි ගානෙන් දැනගන්න ඕනේ. Deferred tax liability creation, deferred tax liability credit, tax expense debit. Deferred tax asset creation, deferred tax asset debit, income tax expense credit. So how we get that deferred tax liability? Taxable temporary difference into tax rate. Deferred tax asset, deductible temporary difference into tax rate. Right. Now we'll take the exercise 2. Again, newly incorporated business, so we don't have opening deferred tax asset or liability. XYZ incorporated on 1st April 2023, and the income tax paid under self-assessment was 600,000, and total income tax liability 900,000. Taxable and deductible temporary difference for the year 800 and 450 respective. 800,000 taxable temporary difference, 450,000 deductible temporary difference. Income tax rate is 30%. And අපිට මුලින්ම ඕන වෙනවා deferred tax asset එකයි liability එකයි calculate කරන්න. Accounts ටික හදන්න කලින් you can go for the calculation. So taxable temporary difference end of the first year, taxable temporary difference 800. Deductible temporary difference 450. Right? Then second year 2025, අපි එකත් මේක වම්ම ගමු. Taxable and deductible temporary difference as at 31st March 2025, 1.2 million and 750,000. Right? And 25 වල 1,200 and 750. මේටි ගානේ දීලානේ තියෙන්නේ. tax rate එක දීලා තියෙනවා අපිට 30%. Tax rate 30%. So taxable temporary difference multiplied by the tax rate, you will get the deferred tax liability. Right? This is my formula. Taxable temporary difference multiplied by the tax rate. So you are given taxable temporary difference, right? 800 into 30%. As at 31st March 2024, deferred tax liability is 240. 1,200 into 30% means 31st March 2025, deferred tax liability 360. Similarly, deductible temporary difference 450 by 31st March 2024, 450 into 30%. Deferred tax asset, deductible temporary difference will lead to deferred tax asset. By 31st March 2024, 135. 750 into 30%, 225. So first we can calculate the deferred tax liability and deferred tax. Taxable temporary difference into tax rate. Result deferred tax liability. Deductible temporary difference into tax rate. deferred tax. Right? මේ වෙලාවේදී taxable temporary difference කියන්නේ මොකක්ද? deductible temporary difference කියන්නේ මොකක්ද කියලා තේරුම් ගන්න ඕන තමයි. අපි step by step යන්නේ. activity 5 වලට එනකොට ඔක්කොම clear. At this point you should know deferred tax liability is the result of taxable temporary difference. Taxable temporary difference multiplied by the tax rate, you will get deferred tax liability. Deductible temporary difference multiplied by the tax rate, you will get deferred tax liability. Right. දැන් අපිට මේකේ T accounts ටික හදා ගන්න පුළුවන්. අපි ඉන්නේ 20යි 23 24 පළවෙනි අවුරුද්ද. දෙවෙනි අවුරුද්ද 24 25. මේ ටික හරිය නේද? deferred tax asset liability calculation part එක. Right. This one. Right. So you can have the structure of the accounts. අපිට ඕනේ deferred income tax expense account එක අවුරුදු දෙකකට ඕනේ. income tax payable එක අවුරුදු දෙකකට ඕනේ. deferred tax asset for 2 years, deferred tax liability for 2 years. Right. Accounts ටික roll කරන්න. And you have some with you, you can even attend. Now, then make activity 1 වගේම තමයි. Right. Accounting part එක 1 වගේ අලුත් දෙයකට තිබ්බේ calculation of the deferred tax liability. Then we come to the accounting. You can attend. So you can attempt this activity, right? Here you see the activity now. You have the figures. right? Now 2023-24, tax paid under self-assessment 600, total income tax liability 900. So tax paid, cash credit, tax expense debit 600, total income tax liability 900. So 900 minus 600, 300 payable. Payable. Then we calculate the deferred tax liability end of the first year, 240, deferred tax asset 135. That is, we were not given the deferred tax liability, but we were given the taxable temporary difference and deductible temporary difference. Multiplied by the tax rate, we have a deferred tax liability 240, deferred tax asset 135. So that deferred tax liability account end of the year carried forward balance. Deferred tax liability account එකේ අවුරුද්ද අන්තිමේ carried forward balance එක තමයි 240 කියලා කියන්නේ. As at the year end balance එක තමයි මේ හොයාගන්නේ, right? This is as at 31st March 2024 deferred tax liability 240. Deferred tax asset 135. එහෙනම් carried forward balance එක credit side එකෙන් debit side එකට යන්න ඕන asset එකක් නම් 130. Sorry. Carried forward balance එක නිසා 35. This is the balance carried. There is no opening balance. Tax liability become 240 means this year creation of deferred tax liability, deferred tax liability creation, deferred tax liability credit, income tax expense debit. Now, අලුතෙන් deferred tax liability එකක් මේ අවුරුද්දට ඇති වෙනවා 240. Tax expense debit, tax liability credit. And new deferred tax asset create 135. Deferred tax asset debit, tax expense credit. So why we are making this deferred tax adjustment? In order to match the tax expense with the accounting profit, because this 600 plus 300, 900 is calculated based on tax law, right? But all other value in the income statement as per the accounting standard. So there's a difference between accounting profit and tax profit resulted due to temporary differences. 240 deferred tax liability and 135 deferred tax asset. Taxable temporary differences නිසා 240 liability එක create වෙලා තියෙනවා. Deductible temporary difference නිසා 135 asset එක. Net result is your tax expense charge to P&L. $1,005. ඒ කියන්නේ අපි 900 වෙනුවට 1005 P&L charge කරනවා. ඇත්තටම tax indirect revenue එකට ගෙවන්නේ 900. right? 600ක් ගෙවලා තියෙනවා 300ක් ගෙවන්න වෙනවා. හැබැයි 900 P&L එකට දැම්මොත් අපේ profit for the year වැරදි. right? මොකද profit for the year හොයද්දි ඔක්කොම ආදායම වියදම් ටික අරන් තියෙන්නේ standards වලට. tax එක විතරක් කෙලින්ම 900 දැම්මොත් එහෙම tax figure එක විතරක් එනවා Inland Revenue Act එකට අනුව tax law එකට. the tax law එකයි accounting law එකයි අතර තියෙන වෙනස්කම් වල නිසා මේ tax figure එකට වෙන බලපෑම temporary difference නිසා වෙලා තියෙන බලපෑම අපි අයින් කරනවා මේකෙන් කරන්නේ. right? මේක 900 වුණාට මේ අවුරුද්දේ 900 වුණාට අනාගතයේදී වෙන්න තියෙන impact එකක් ගත්තොත් ඇත්තටම 1005ක් මේ අවුරුද්දේ tax වෙන්නේ. right? temporary difference වල තියෙන impact එක ඒක adjust කිරීම තමයි මේකෙන් කරන්නේ. ඒ හරහා මොකද කරන්නේ අපි tax expense එක 1005 කියලා P&L charge කරනවා. So you are taking more accurate profit for the P. Right? That's the rationale. So the income tax payable balance carried forward 300. We have the next year brought forward balance 300. Deferred tax liability, 240 carried forward balance become the opening balance of the next year. Deferred tax asset 135 become the opening balance of the next year. Right. Now the second year, tax paid, the last year tax payable fully settled, tax paid under self-assessment for 2025 750, total income tax liability 950. ඉස්සරලා මේ payable එක ගෙවලා දානවා. Cash credit, tax payable debit. Then tax paid under self-assessment for the second year 750. Total tax liability 950. So we have 200 payable. You can transfer that into tax payable account. Right? Tax paid under self-assessment, cash credit, tax expense debit. End of the year tax payable 200, tax expense debit, tax payable credit. Now we have already calculated what is the deferred tax liability and deferred tax asset end of 2025. Deferred tax liability 360, asset 225. Let us calculate kara. Taxable temporary difference into tax rate. Deferred tax liability. Deductible temporary difference into tax rate, deferred tax asset. So we have deferred tax liability carried forward balance 360. Deferred tax asset carried forward balance 225. Now our balances දෙක අපි හොයාගත්තා. Now pass the double entry. 240 increase to 360. Right? එතකොට මේ account එක balance කරොත් අපිට ගන්න පුළුවන්. අලුතෙන් deferred tax liability එකට කීයක් create වුණාද? 240 become 360 means the creation of deferred tax liability 120. Deferred tax liability credit, income tax expense debit. Now deferred tax asset, year-end balance 225. But opening balance 135. So increase in the deferred tax asset, that is the new deferred tax asset creation by 90. Debit deferred tax asset, credit income tax expense. Deferred tax liability create with the income tax expense debit, deferred tax liability credit. When the deferred tax asset is created, deferred tax asset debit, income tax expense credit. So we have 1070 debit side. So you charge to P&L 980. So the tax payable account, credit side 500, 300 opening balance settle. So your carried forward balance equal to the current year payable. So in the statement of profit or loss and other comprehensive income, you record the tax expense 1005 and 960. Deferred tax asset, statement of financial position, you can show deferred tax asset, liability and taxpayer. Deferred tax asset, non-current asset, deferred tax liability, non-current liability. Income tax payable is a current liability. That's it. Any question, those who join online here? So far what we discussed, due to temporary difference between the accounting rule and the tax rule, the tax paid to inland revenue can differ to the tax calculated based on accounting process. So we are making adjustment, reverse that and adjust the tax expense more in line with accounting standard instead of tax rule. For that we make this deferred tax adjustment. So there are two types of deferred tax adjustment. One is deferred tax liability, other one deferred tax. When there is a temporary difference between tax law and the taxable profit and accounting profit, and if that difference resulting more tax payable in the future, so we call it deferred tax liability. So that difference is called taxable temporary difference. Multiplied by the tax rate, you get the deferred tax liability. Due to the difference, if we have to, now we are paying more tax and future tax will be deducted. It's a deductible temporary difference. Multiplied by the tax rate, you get the deferred tax. The accounting for deferred tax liability, when the deferred tax liability creation, deferred tax liability creation, deferred tax liability debit, credit, income tax expense debit. So here you see the entries, right? Creation of deferred tax liability, income tax expense debit, deferred tax liability credit. Creation of deferred tax asset, deferred tax asset debit, tax expense credit. The deferred tax වල entry එකක් අනිවාර්යෙන් යන්න ඕන income tax expense එක. Income tax expense එක adjust කරන්න. Asset එකක් create වෙනවා නම් asset එක debit නේ. එහෙනම් අනිත් entry යන්න ඕන tax expense. Liability එකක් create වෙනවා නම් liability එක credit නේ. ඒතර අනිත් entry යන්න ඕන tax expense. මොකද මේ create වෙන liability එකයි asset එකයි cash වෙන්නේ නැහැ. මේක create වෙලා reverse වෙනවා. right? දැන් මේ විදිහට deferred tax liability create වුණානේ. ඔක reverse වෙන්නත් පුළුවන්. create වෙලා reverse වෙන එක තමයි වෙන්නේ. reverse වෙනකොට එහෙනම් liability එක debit වෙලා tax expense credit කරා. Now this activity 2, we just exercise 2 we finish. Now we have the deferred tax liability 360 now. End of 2025. 2026, when you calculate the deferred tax liability, if it becomes 300, now the closing balance 360, next year opening balance 360. If the closing balance becomes 300, the deferred tax liability reduces. That is the reversal. Right? The liability liability account debit කරන්න වෙනවා. අනිත් entry එක හැම වෙලේම deferred tax වල යන්නේ income tax expense. Always one entry from the deferred tax adjustment should go to the income tax expense. ඒක මේක කටපාඩම් කරන්න ඕනේ නැහැ. Liability එකක් create වෙනවා නම් liability credit කියන එක ඔයාලා දන්නවනේ. If asset create, asset should be debit. So if the asset decrease, the asset credit. And the asset credit, other entry should go to the income tax expense. Right? And more importantly, when you calculate this deferred tax asset and liability, that is the year-end balance. So taxable temporary difference as at 31st March 2024, multiplied by the tax rate, you will get the deferred tax liability as at 31st March 2020. Then this is deferred tax liability as at 31st March 2025. So 2024 to 25, increase is only 120, that is the create. 2024 is the newly started business. That's the first year. That's why year-end balance 240, creation also 240. Right? But second year onward, it's the difference between opening and closing balance. You can find some of your microphone is unmuted. Make sure that it is mute. Okay. Right. Clear? So this activity, taxable temporary difference is given. Deductible temporary difference is given. But practically from the accounting record, you don't find taxable temporary difference and deductible temporary. Right? මේ values අපිට accounting records වල නැහැ. Accounting records වල අපිට තියෙනවා asset එක carrying amount. Liability එක carrying amount. Net book value. Right? අපි asset වල තමයි carrying amount කියන එක much more you maybe use that carrying amount of an asset. This carrying amount is therefore liability. That is the book value. Right? Then for the tax purpose, if you pass the double entry based on tax purpose, we can have a value for asset and liability. We call it tax base. Tax base. Actually, this taxable and deductible temporary difference is calculated by comparing carrying amount and the tax base, right? So this is how we calculate taxable and deductible temporary difference. When you take an asset, if carrying amount of asset greater than tax base, it would be taxable temporary difference. Carrying amount of an asset greater than tax base. Taxable temporary difference. මේක කටපාඩම් කරගන්න වෙනවා. පළවෙනි ලයින් එක. අර ඩබල් එන්ට්‍රි ප්‍රින්සිපල් වල asset increase debit කියන එක මතක තියාගත්තා නම් ඉතිරි ටික ඔක්කොම රෂනල් එකෙන් හදන්න පුළුවන්. ඒ වගේ carrying amount of an asset is greater than tax base result in taxable temporary difference. මොකද දැන් අපි හිතමු asset එකක් depreciate කරලා තියෙනවා accounting වලට. අපි අර පළවෙනි උදාහරණය ගත්තොත් අපි purchase machinery for 100 million. Accounting purpose depreciate over 10 years. So annual depreciation 10 million, end of the first year, carrying amount 90 million. Same machinery, tax depreciation 20%. So first year 20 million depreciate. Tax base is 80 million. Right? So carrying amount of the machinery 90 million, the accounting value. As for the tax law, the carrying amount, that is called tax base. Value as per the tax law, tax base, 80 million. Now the carrying amount 90, tax base 80. So carrying amount exceed the tax base. The difference is taxable temporary difference. Taxable temporary difference will lead for deferred tax asset or liability. Taxable temporary difference now, deferred tax liability. Deductible temporary difference now, deferred tax asset. Right? MIA. The carrying amount of an asset greater than tax base. That's a taxable temporary. ඉතින් carrying amount එක tax base එකට වඩා asset එක වැඩි නම් deferred taxable temporary difference නම් අඩුයි නම් අනිත් පැත්තට යන්න ඕනේ. deductible. asset එකට සම්පූර්ණ opposite way තමයි liability එක create වෙන්නේ. එහෙමනේ asset increase debit, liability increase credit. asset එකට total opposite එක. එහෙනම් liability එක carrying amount greater than tax base, that is a deductible temporary. Liability carrying amount less than tax base, taxable. That's why I told you, you need not to remember all four. If you know the first one, rest you can rationally develop. Right? Carrying amount of an asset is greater than tax base will result in taxable temporary difference. එහෙමනම් carrying amount එක tax base එකට අඩු වුණොත් deductible temporary difference. ඕකේ opposite එක තමයි liability එකට එන්න. Asset එක carrying amount greater than tax base, taxable temporary difference. So liability carrying amount greater than tax base, deductible temporary. Taxable temporary difference into tax rate, you will get deferred tax liability. Deductible temporary difference into tax rate, you will get deferred tax. Right. මේක දැනට ස්ලයිඩ් එක නැත්නම් අඩු ගන්න මේ පළවෙනි එක ඔයගොල්ලෝ නෝට්බුක් එකේ හරි නෝට් කරගන්න. ගාන හදන්න අපිට මේ knowledge එක ඕනේ. asset එකක carrying amount greater than tax base, taxable temporary මේ කෙටියෙන් ලියන්න පුළුවන් carrying amount CA, tax base TB කියලා ලියන්න පුළුවන්. Right. CA greater than TB, TTD, taxable temporary difference. For an asset, right? CA less than TB, result DTD, deductible temporary. Right? Right. Now we'll take the exercise 3. Income tax paid under self-assessment for 2024 and 25. Total income tax liability. You are given carrying amount of plant and machinery and tax base of plant and machinery. Carrying amount of motor vehicle and tax base of motor vehicle. Asset වර්ග දෙකක දීලා තියෙනවා. Right. දැන් asset එකක් අපි plant and machinery ගන්නකො. Carrying amount 4,000. Tax base 3,000. So carrying amount exceed the tax base. Carrying amount greater than tax base. The difference is 1,000. This 1,000 is taxable temporary difference. Asset, if a carrying amount greater than tax base, it is taxable temporary difference. ඒකනේ කලින් slide එකේ හොයාගන්න. right. Asset එකක carrying amount එක book value එක වැඩි tax base එකට වඩා. ඕකේ rationale එක ගත්තොත් දැන් carrying amount එකනේ ඉස්සරහ depreciate කරන්න තියෙන්නේ. right. So accounting purpose you can depreciate 4,000 more. But tax base only 3,000. So tax වලට අඩුවෙන් depreciate කරන්න තියෙනවා කියන්නේ tax amount එක වැඩි වෙනවා වැඩිපුර tax ගෙවන්න. Right? That's the rationale. Compared with the accounting profit. That's why it's a deferred tax liability. So any asset, if carrying amount exceed the tax base, the difference is taxable temporary difference. Then if you look at the motor vehicle, now carrying amount 2,400, 2,000, tax base 2,400. Now tax base greater than the carrying amount. So the 400 difference is deductible temporary difference. Right? So we can first take these values for the deferred tax asset liability calculation. Plant and machinery 2024-25. The carrying amount is 4,000. Tax base 3,000. Motor vehicle carrying amount 2,000. Tax base 2,400. දැන් මෙතන වෙනසක් එනවා. වෙනස බලලා තමයි අපිට decide කරන්න වෙන්නේ whether the carrying amount is greater than tax base or tax base greater than carrying amount. Plant and machinery carrying amount 4,000, tax base 3,000. The difference 1,000 carrying amount is more. So we take it as taxable temporary difference. Tax rate of the company, income tax rate 30%. Taxable temporary difference එක තියෙනවා නම් you take the tax rate 30%. So the deferred tax liability carrying amount into tax rate 300. Motor vehicle carrying amount 2,000, tax base 2,400. Tax rate greater than carrying amount. So the difference is deductible temporary difference multiplied by the 30% tax rate. We have a deferred tax asset of 120. දැන් ඔය විදිහට 2025 values දීලා තියෙනවා. And you complete the rest of this Now the 2025 plant and machinery carrying amount 2000, tax base 0. So difference is 2000. So tax rate is same. So 2000 into 30% is 600. Motor vehicle, we had a deductible temporary difference, initially 400, this year 800. Multiplied by 30%, deferred tax asset 440. අපිට ඕන මෙන්න මේ values ටික deferred tax liability අවුරුදු දෙකේ තියෙනවා 300 600 deferred tax asset එක එනවා 120 240. Any question regarding the calculation this part? මේක මොනවද ප්‍රශ්නයක් තියෙනවා? දැන් බලන්න asset එක carrying amount එක 12 එක සහ tax base එක. tax වලට අනුව tax law එක අනුව asset එකේ value. If the carrying amount greater than tax base, the resulting temporary difference is taxable temporary. Asset එක carrying amount එක tax base එකට වඩා වැඩි නම් ඒ වෙනස taxable temporary. ඒක දන්නවද? අඩු ඉඳන් කොහොමද liability කොහොමද කියන එක අපිට actually අනිත් පැත්තට ගන්න. Now you can prepare the accounts. I will show you the activity, right? දැන් අර කලින් වගේම accounts හතර හදන්න තියෙන්නේ. For that you need tax paid during the period, tax payable. Right? Now we have the deferred tax asset and liability balance. Then you complete the income tax expense, tax payable, deferred tax asset, deferred tax liability. For the 2 years. So you can prepare the accounts, right? මේක වැඩසටහන කපන්නේ හදන්න. Right? දැන් මේ කියලා බලමින් පාන හදන්න ඉච්චලා. Again, account for the tax payable, and just deferred tax asset and liability have already calculated. right? Here the 2024 tax paid 600, total income tax 925. So tax paid under self-assessment 600, cash credit, tax expense debit. Then the total tax liability 925. So that means we have 325 tax payable, debit tax expense, credit tax payable, debit tax expense, credit tax payable. Then end of the first year, deferred tax liability 300. So deferred tax liability account balance carried forward should be 300. That means this year creation of deferred tax liability should be 300. No opening balance, so tax expense debit 300, deferred tax liability credit 300. The deferred tax asset carried forward balance, we have already calculated that 120. That means this year creation of carried forward balance 120. So this year creation of deferred tax asset should be 120. Debit deferred tax asset, credit income tax expense. So the first year tax expense account, debit side 1,225. When you take that into the credit, the tax expense charged to P&L 1,105. Tax payable account, you can carry forward the balance to next year, 325. Deferred tax liability brought forward balance 300. Deferred tax asset brought forward balance 120. The first year. So the second year, tax paid under self-assessment 500, total income tax liability 800. First of all, we have to pay this last year payable. මේක මුලින්ම ගෙවන්න වෙනවා. මේ අවුරුද්දේ පළවෙනි ක්වාටර් එකේ ගෙවන්නේ ඕක 325. Right? The second quarter එකේ තමයි first quarter එකේ self-assessment payment එක කරන්නේ. So likewise during the year 500 ඔක්කොම ගෙවලා තියෙනවා. ඕක ඇත්තට තුන් පාරකට ගෙවෙන්නේ. right? quarters තුනේ. නමුත් අපි double entries තියද්දි ඔයාලට අවුරුද්දේ වැලිව ගෙවපු ගාන දීලා තියෙනවා. We can make it as a one entry. right? ඇත්තටම ගත්තොත් ඔය 500 installment තුනකින් ගෙවන්නේ. quarters තුනක. කලින් මේ 600 උත් කොටස් තුනකින් ගෙවන්නේ. right? So then year end balance is 800. The total tax liability 800. That means 300 payable. Credit tax payable, debit tax expense. Now end of the second year, deferred tax liability balance we calculated 600. Deferred tax asset balance carried forward 240. So balances දෙක අපි හොයාගත්තා. Calculate කරලා. Based on taxable and temporary, deductible temporary difference multiplied by the tax rate. So taxable temporary difference into tax rate, deferred tax liability. Deductible temporary difference into tax rate, deferred tax asset. අවුරුද්ද මුල 300යි, අග 600යි. ඒ කියන්නේ මේ අවුරුද්දේ creation of deferred tax liability 300. Deferred tax asset 120 increased to 240. වෙන්න ඕනේ. This is a creation of deferred tax asset 120. Deferred tax asset debit, income tax expense credit. So you can show these income tax expense for the 2 years. දැන් මේක අපිට ගානේ දීලා තියෙනවනේ property plant and equipment carrying amount දෙකක් දීලා තියෙනවනේ. Carrying amount of plant and machinery and carrying amount of motor vehicle. එහෙනම් ඔකත් අපිට financial statement වල පෙන්නන්න පුළුවන්. මේ තමයි property plant and equipment වල 4000 plus 2000 PPE carrying amount එක තියෙනවා 6000. දෙවෙනි අවුරුද්ද යනකොට 2000 and 1000 property plant and equipment 3000. Deferred tax asset 120 to 240. Deferred tax asset එකේ carried forward balance එක. Deferred tax liability වල 306. Okay. Any question?
Hello, sir. Hello, sir.
Yes.
Sir, I have a small question.
Yes.
That is not related to this exercise. This is related to the first example you explained for us. The 1 million asset which is depreciation for the 10% for the financial profit accounting purposes and the taxation purposes 20%. Can you explain after 5 years that 20% for the taxation, then from the beginning of the sixth year, how we will identify the deferred tax?
No, now similar to this activity, she's asking that my example, I explain you 100 million,
Yes.
accounting purpose 10 years, tax purpose, accounting purpose 10%, tax purpose 20%, right?
Yes, sir.
So when it's come to the fifth end of the fifth year, tax purpose fully depreciated, so tax base 0, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then the
Yeah.
carrying amount end of the fifth year, 50, right?
Mm-hmm.
So then the carrying amount 50, tax base 0. So you have a taxable temporary difference 50 multiplied by the tax rate. If it is 30, it will get 50. Next up to the next year, still tax base 0, but now carrying amount reduce. So then the difference decrease. You will see the reversal. Now once it is fully depreciated, carrying amount of tax base becomes 0. Thereafter it continues 0. You make this comparison, no? This
Tax base
comparison.
continuously 0, sir, right?
Yes. Once it is fully depreciated,
Yeah.
accounting purpose fully depreciate, carrying amount 0. Tax purpose fully depreciate, it is 0. It will never go beyond 0, right? Fully depreciate නම් එතන 0 එච්චරයි. එතකොට මේ ඩිෆරන්ස් එකෙන් හැදෙනවා ඊළඟ අවුරුද්දේ දැන් මේක carrying amount එක තව අඩු වෙනවනේ. එතකොට tax base එක 0 නිසා අපි මේකම 2026 බැලුවොත් අපි හිතමු දැන් carrying amount එක 1000යි කියලා. Tax base එක 0. Now the difference is 1000. So the deferred tax liability decreases. That is where the reversal comes. Got it? You have a similar activity in exercise 4. Right? Now this exercise 4, you see carrying amount of plant and machinery 3000, tax base 0. Once it becomes 0, thereafter 0. So that second year also tax base 0, but carrying amount 2000. And the motor vehicle carrying amount 0, that means accounting purpose fully depreciated. Fully depreciated වුණාට පස්සේ ආයෙ depreciate වෙන්නේ නැහැ නේ. බිඳුව වුණාට පස්සේ ඒක දිගටම බිඳ. And tax base 2500 reduced to 2000. Right? Now we can prepare that table. We prepare the previous one, the carrying amount and tax base, and calculate the profit. Can you? Again, මේකම හදන්න පුළුවන් exercise 4 එකට දැන්. Exercise 4 වලට. Now you have carrying amount of plant and machinery 3000, tax base 0. Tax base 0 කියන්නේ tax purpose fully depreciate. අර මගේ උදාහරණය අවුරුදු මිලියන 100 20% ගියොත් පස්වෙනි අවුරුද්ද ඉවරුණා වගේ. එතනින් එහාට 0. Right? දැන් මේ continuing business එකක්. මේක අපිට දෙනවා carrying amount 3000, tax base 0. 24 වල. Carried plant and machinery carrying amount 3000, tax base 0. ඒ කියන්නේ වෙනස 3000යි. Deferred tax liability එක 900. Motor vehicle carrying amount 0, tax base 2,500. $2,500 deductible temporary difference, 30%, 750. Now 2025, the plant and machinery carrying amount 2,000. Tax base, once it becomes 0, continuously thereafter 0. Now the deferred tax liability, 900 decreased to 600. Now that is the reversal. Motor vehicle carrying amount 0, tax base 2,000. Now the deductible temporary difference 2,000. 30% of that deferred tax asset is 600. You see 750 reduced to 600. Right. Now, interestingly, here the deferred tax liability 900 to 600, that difference 300 reversal. What about 2024? This is not a newly started business. So we have deferred tax liability, DTL deferred tax liability and DTA deferred tax asset. 31st March 2023 were 450,000 and 500,000 respective. අපිට පටන් ගන්නකොට opening balance එකක් තියෙනවා deferred tax liability 450, deferred tax asset 500. Right? With those opening balance, can you prepare the accounts? income tax expense account, tax payable account. ඒ දෙකේ opening balance අපිට දීලා නැහැ. ඒ tax expense කොහොමත් නැහැ. tax payable එකේ current opening balance එකක් නැහැ. right? එහෙනම් මේ අවුරුද්දේ ඉඳලා පටන් ගන්න පුළුවන්. But deferred tax liability 450 opening balance, deferred tax asset 500 opening balance. වෙනත් විදිහට ගත්තොත් මේ මෙතන 2023 tax deferred tax liability 450 ඉඳලා තමයි 900 වලට වැඩි වෙන්නේ. Deferred tax asset එක 2023 වල 500 ඉඳලා තමයි 25 වල 750 වලට වැඩි වෙන්නේ. Right? You were given the opening balance of deferred tax liability 450, deferred tax asset 500. Rest same as what we discussed. Right? You can have the deferred tax income tax expense account 500 paid, 825 total, so 325 payable. Shall we start the four accounts? Income tax expense, income tax payable, deferred tax liability, deferred tax asset. 23, 24 and 24, 25. Okay. ඔව් මේ යාර එලිෂාන්ගේ papers ටික එක දවල්ට. ඔව්. හ්ම්. customer, banking industry. BSAA overall. So, I'm making some proposal to the මේ පැත්තේ නෑ හිත ඉන්නේ නෑ ඉන්නේ ස්කීම් එක. කියන්නේ මොමාගම තිහානේ ඉන්නේ ස්කීම්. එහෙම නැත්නම් ගෙදරට එවන්න පුළුවන් ඊට වඩා ළඟ ගෙදරට. ඔව්. නෑ කොල්ල මේ කැස් බෑ. ඔව්. හරි. ඊළඟට මේ අර ඔයා කිව්වේ මේක මම හිතන්නේ හරි කියලා හරි ඩිපාර්ට්මන්ට් එකට ඇවිත් මට ඊයේ ඩිපාර්ට්මන්ට් එකෙන් කෝල් කරලා බන්ඩල් එක. ඔව් ඒක මට මන්ඩේට බලලා දෙන්න පුළුවන්. මට මන්ඩේට අරගෙන මම ටියුස්ඩේ උදේ වෙද්දි මට බලන්න පුළුවන්. ඔව් ඔව් හරි. හරි. මේක අද දීගත්තොත් හැබැයි මට ලේසි. ඒකට මේක මේ බලාගෙන අරක බලන්න පුළුවන් තව. ඔව් අනිත් එක. හරි. ඔව් හරි. Right. So right. So we will take this tax expense account to 23, 24, 24, 25. Right. So the income tax paid under self-assessment, දැන් මේකේ deferred tax liability එකේ opening balance එකක් තියෙනවා 450. deferred tax asset එකේ opening balance එකක් තියෙනවා 500. ඒක අපි ගාන පටන් ගත්තී ගානේ දීලා තියෙනවා. right? ඒක රෙකෝඩ් කරලා පටන් ගන්න ඕන. right? opening balance of deferred tax asset and liability. Tax expense, no opening balance because it's an expense account. 500 paid under self-assessment. Total 825. So 325 payable, can transfer that into the payable account. End of the first year, we calculated the deferred tax liability 900, deferred tax asset 750. Right? That we have already calculated 900 and 750. So deferred tax liability end of the year carried forward 900. Deferred tax asset 750. Again, පළවෙනි අවුරුද්දේ 450 increased to 900. There's a creation of deferred tax liability. Deferred tax liability credit, tax expense debit. 450. Deferred tax asset $500 increased to 750. So creation of deferred tax asset by 250. Deferred tax asset debit, tax expense credit. So the tax expense account when we balance can take to P&L 1025. Tax payable account we can carry it forward to next year 325. Deferred tax liability, the opening balance of next year 900, deferred tax asset 750. 2024 වල වෙනසක් නෑ අපි කලින් හදපු විදිහමයි. Right? Creation of deferred tax liability and creation of deferred tax asset. The entries ටික කලින් විදිහමයි වෙනසක්ම නෑ. Now year 2, 2025, 650 paid, 850 total liability. ඊට කලින් මේ පළවෙනි අවුරුද්දේ 325 payable එක ගෙවන්න වෙනවනේ, right? We'll pay that amount. Then 2025 paid under self assessment 650. Total liability 850. So another 200 payable. $200 debit tax expense, credit tax payable. Right? Now we have calculated the deferred tax liability and deferred tax asset year-end balance. Liability 600, asset also 600. Then අපිට deferred tax liability එකේ carried forward balance එක 600 වෙනවා. What that mean? 900 decreased to 600. So it's a reversal. අපිට 900 600 එනවා deferred tax liability එක debit කරන්න වෙන්නේ. Credit tax expense. That is deferred tax liability. This is a reversal, right? Deferred tax asset also same way. And 750. Right. So here, deferred tax asset carried forward balance, 2025 asset carried forward balance 600. Or 750, 600 වලට අඩු වෙලා තියෙනවා. So asset also reversal. $150 deferred tax asset credit, tax expense debit. දැන් මේවා කටපාඩම් කරන්න දෙයක් නැහැ. account එක හදපුවාම වැඩි වෙලා නම් එකතු වෙනවා, අඩු වෙලා නම් අඩු වෙන්න ඕනේ. එතකොට දැන්ට තියෙන balance එක 750, closing balance එක 600. So reduce by 150. එතන මේකේ අනිත් entry එක හැම වෙලේම deferred tax එක account එකේ අනිත් entry යන්නේ income tax expense එක. So if you are crediting the deferred tax, you have to debit the tax expense, right? Whether it is deferred tax liability or deferred tax asset, one entry should go to the income tax expense එක. මේ tax expense එකේ adjustment එකනේ අපි කරන්නේ. So you can take that 150. So altogether, we can charge to P&L 700 second. So tax payable account, we have a carried forward balance of 200. Tax expense එක P&L charge කරපු tax expense එක තියෙනවා 1025 and 700. Statement of financial position. Current asset වලට ආවේ මේ carrying amount එක plant and machinery and carrying amount 0 motor vehicle. නිසා plant and machinery විතරයි තියෙන carrying amount 3000 and 2000. Any question? You need to mark your attendance, right? Okay, right. So with that, you can take your lunch break, right? So we had to take little longer because we had to start little late, right? Of some technical difficulties, right? So we'll continue the discussion. We have a small part of this topic next week, right? Okay.